Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning to hear more about Jeff's recently released paper, Against the Odds, Driving Defense Innovation in a Change-Resistant Ecosystem. And today's event is part of a broader series we have at CSIS called Implementing Innovation Series, which is trying to examine innovation in addition to all the neat gee-whiz technology stuff that's always fun to look at, but also look at institutional innovation, process innovation, what it takes to really make a more innovative approach or to realize innovation in organizations, especially large organizations like the Department of Defense, a reality. And that's certainly a major focus of Jeff's paper, and that's why we're pleased to help him release it today. Before we get into the substance, I want to give you a brief security announcement, as we do at the beginning of all our events, to let you know that we have a well-thought-out security plan here at CSIS. If anything were to happen, I'll be your security officer, and we would either exit through the back or out the front, depending on where the situation that we were responding to originated, and we would give you further guidance. We also have a voice of God system that would help us know what to do in the event of an emergency, but that's very unlikely to happen. And so we'll look forward to having a great event today. After Jeff's remarks, we have a panel discussion lined up for you to kind of dive into this question of what does it take to move past the resistance to change that every organization has, but that's certainly somewhat notorious at the Department of Defense. But to introduce Jeff, I'm going to welcome to the podium Arnold Panaro, who's going to introduce Jeff. Arnold really needs no introduction, especially here at CSIS, where he's a frequent contributor. But he is the CEO of the Panaro Group, a Washington-based consulting firm that he founded in 2010 that specializes in federal budget and market analysis, business strategy and capture, acquisition due diligence, government relations, communications, and actually quite an extensive list of other things as well. In 2015, Arnold completed a 2-year term as chairman of the National Defense Industrial Association. He's also a retired Marine Corps general. I'm told at one time he worked in the Senate in some capacity. And he recently published a book about his rather remarkable experiences throughout his career on war and politics, The Battlefield Inside Washington's Beltway. So, Arnold?
Well, thank you and good morning. Thank you, Andrew. And I'd also like to thank CSIS for hosting this event and all the other great events in national security they do. The national security team here, I'll tell you, is second to none, from Kath Hicks to Mark Cancian and Todd Harrison, of course, Andrew Hunter, and many, many others. It's a great organization. My old boss, Senator Nunn, was the chairman for many years, and John Hamry, who's the current CEO, I actually hired him off CBO to come, as Greg Dahlberg, my colleague, and I know, to come work on the Armed Services Committee back in 1987. And I've had and it's a privilege to introduce the author of the report, Against the Odds, Driving Defense Innovation in a Change-Resistant Ecosystem, Jeff Bialos. I've known Jeff for many, many years. He served in the Commerce Department, the State Department. At the Department of Defense, he was the head of the Industrial Affairs. He was a deputy undersecretary doing all the work related to the industrial base and working with our industries and working with our overseas trade. I was the staff director of the committee at that time. He was extremely helpful and knowledgeable, not just to the Congress, but to our industry. He's been on the Defense Science Board, member of the Council on Foreign Relations. This is someone that knows the defense industry and knows this area inside out. We all know, we've all been around a long time. There have been several hundred reports, studies, surveys, investigations, and evaluation of the acquisition process. I've worked on a lot of them myself. There have been so many reports and so many recommendations and so many changes, suggestions. I think Jeff and his colleagues were correct in choosing their title, that the defense acquisition process is a, quote, change-resistant ecosystem, end quote. I recall one senior official once commenting that we've produced a system that is designed to, quote, prevent anything bad from happening quickly. Unfortunately, it prevents anything good from happening quickly either, end quote. Jeff and his co-author state that, quote, it is also no secret that over the last several decades, there have been literally dozens of announced procurement reforms, but no grand improvements, end quote. And frankly, and I'll talk in a minute, because there has been a lot of positive change, but if you look at the broad output, and if you look at bang for the buck, and I think this is one reason that Secretary Mattis is so insistent on reform, we're roughly spending $400 billion a year on goods and services, supplies and equipment, and about the only thing charitable you can say about the big picture result is spend more, take longer, get less. That is not a good result, and that's why that's got to be changed. There have been improvements. I think we've got to give Andrew and Secretary Kendall and Ash Carter and many others, the Congress, Thornberry, McCain, over the years, we've made progress. They've worked diligently to change that result, to change Norm Augustine's lessons learned that, hey, we keep on the path we're on, we're going to be buying one fighter airplane. And a lot of what Norm said way back when is coming true. So the issue is not how far we've come, because we have made improvements, and the people that work in the system every day try to do better, but it's how far we have to go, and we certainly have a long way to go. And the fact that it's made improvements is Barry Watts, who used to run PA&E, he wrote, when he talked about the output, he said, if a nation had the option of picking a national defense industrial base, quote, the American military-industrial complex would surely be the one most people and nations would choose, end quote. And, there's a big announcement about, the president's travels in Saudi Arabia, and they're buying a lot of our equipment, and some of our great industry leaders are here today, we never want our troops to be in a fair fight, and thanks to American industry, we hope they never will be. But again, another reason we've got to do what Jeff and his colleagues are talking about is, I personally think the McCain-Thornberry budget levels are the right levels to dig us out of the hole and begin to rebuild our military. But as Kay Granger, the chairman of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, said yesterday, and she's kind of in the thick of it, hey, we're going to be lucky to get the Trump budget for 18, much less the higher numbers. And so we've got to have these reforms. Now, reforms are always going to lag the increases. We need the increases first. And anybody that tells you can pay for the buildup we need with just reforms, that arithmetic doesn't work. But we've got to get started. So Jeff suggests many steps that could be taken if we want to, address these issues. And so it's a great privilege for me to be able to introduce Jeff and his colleagues. A great piece of work, something we ought to take seriously. I know the building. I know Secretary Mattis, as well as those in the Congress, as well as the new administration. They are very, very bent on reform, and we need to help them in any way we can. In fact, if I think about one last thing on the industrial base, the White House has actually created a new organization in the White House to help focus on manufacturing and industrial base, and the person that's leading it in the defense area is an individual that used to work for Randy Forbes, a great champion of national security. So there's an opportunity for all of us to help make some of the changes that Jeff and his co-authors recommend. So with that, Jeff, congratulations on a great piece of work, and thank you for the privilege of allowing me to introduce you here this morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much for that introduction, Arnold. I know he had to go because he's briefing a couple of people who are about to go before the Senate to work at the department. I just want to say I really appreciate Arnold and his role in this. And, Arnold's been on the Defense Business Board for a number of years, and they've suggested a lot of reforms. There's some others I'd like to thank here today. If I can ask Christine Fisher and Stuart Cole to stand for a minute. They were my co-contributors on this study, so thank you very much for your role. And without them, there wouldn't be a study. The Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins, which sponsored this. I'd like to thank Andrew and his staff, and Caitlin and Kath Hicks for hosting this event, and of course our panelists here today, who will be here in a few minutes to do as they will with the study and make whatever comments they so choose. I'd also be remiss not to thank my wife, who watched me write this in the evening hours, who's sitting over there. So thank you, dear. So let me, what I want to do is I'll start with really the crux of this, which is, the Defense Department, by all measures, is a successful organization. It is the premier defense organization in the world, bar none. that has allowed us to have military superiority for many years. In that is part of the dilemma here, because it is wedded to its existing and successful operational paradigms and capabilities, and that encourages and creates a risk aversion to the introduction of new and innovative capabilities and processes. And the consequence of this is that DoD has ended up with antiquated, slow, and cumbersome R&D and procurement processes, and despite calls from people like CSIS and other organizations, DoD has showed an unwillingness over the years, a demonstrated unwillingness to use all the alternative mechanisms available for procurement, from the commercial side to OTAs and otherwise. In a word, the challenge here is how do you make it a less unnatural act for the next SpaceX to do business with the department, and for the department to accept and embrace the next SpaceX rather than spend a decade resisting it through litigation and other measures? How do you get the department to accept and take on the UAV technology of the future rather than resist it? That's in a nutshell the challenge. And let me just say, I'll start out where I'm going to end up, which is there have been a lot of studies. There's been a lot of incentive created. There have been a lot of suggestions. I think what we need at this point is, really a culture change. The new leadership team, as they come in, I think, unfortunately, they have to use forcing functions to do some of this. I don't say that lightly, because you'd like to do it through incentives, but I think the reality is that we need a system of forcing functions and mandated measures that's allowed new DoD to seek out rather than resist this kind of change, and to infuse risk-taking into this inherently reverse culture, to access not just one or two sources of innovation, and not just the fad of the day, but all types of innovation, to embrace new and agile processes, and to rely on alternatives to the traditional DoD approach to contracting. But let me sort of start the beginning here for a minute. The Obama administration, to its credit, has framed these issues for the last couple of years, and has focused on the erosion of U.S. dominance and military superiority, and put it in the context of globalization of technology, which allowed our dominance to erode on the one hand and allowed technology to be dispersed to our adversaries on the other. But what the administration really didn't address directly is the underlying issue or premise of that, which is, what's wrong with our defense ecosystem that it hasn't produced more game changers? We have a $72 billion RDT&E budget. Think of it like an aircraft carrier. In effect, the notion is that it's not working too well. It's a very variegated thing with DARPA, with R&D commands, with labs, with FFRDCs, with the defense industry, the small business, commercial industry. In effect, they've signaled it's not working. And what do you do about it? And they've not really articulated the diagnosis, what the problem is. And the solution that they've kind of laid out there is, rather than work on the carrier, they've created a shiny new thing on the side called DIUX and a number of things like it, and to put out as an illustrative example of what to do. So what we sort of set out to do here is say, what are the issues with the carrier, so to speak, and how do you address them? And we kind of developed a number of metrics in the report that went through this at some depth. And look, the first one is we looked at the money. This isn't about the money, by and large. DoD has had a lot of money for RDT&E through sequestration, through war, through peacetime cuts in the post-Cold War years. We've kept our RDT&E line pretty good and pretty robust and pretty stable. So the problem here is not so much about money. There is an issue about priorities, because frankly it's hard to divine our investment priorities in this area. Part of it's because it's such a big and decentralized system, and part of it is because it tends to lurch from one thing to another. You had a period, not surprisingly, of the war years where a lot of the RDT&E system gravitated toward these committees and short-term things, and to support the low-intensity warfighting of the day and away from what's the high-intensity warfare, what we're now talking about as offsets. From '08 onward, we've had a movement back in that direction. A lot of the focus since '08 has actually been moving already toward that long before the Defense Innovation Initiative came out. So it's not really about the money, but it is something about the priorities and trying to maintain a set of cohesive priorities in a large and unwieldy organization. The issue that's been the focus of attention is, are we accessing all the best and most vibrant sources of technology? And the focus in this has been on two areas. One is the commercial, and I would add the foreign. But there are lots of other sources of technology. As I said, there's small business, there's labs. And it's important for the department, I think, holistically to look at this and look at each of these and say, are we getting enough bang for the buck out of each of these technology sources? On the commercial side, there's been a lot of discussion the last couple of years that there's a wall between the Department of Defense and the commercial sector. I agree that there are areas where our access to commercial technology is lumpy, and we don't get as much in some areas as others. I also agree that the commercial processes we use are antiquated. But I will say, and I don't think we get enough technology at the front end. We don't have enough visibility at what's going on in some of the front-end labs of some of our leading companies. But what I will say is, I think it's a bit unfair to talk about these walls, because I think the fact is the department has drawn on and been very connected with the commercial sector for many years. I mean, commercial technology is the heart of many of our defense systems. The information revolution is reflected in our C4ISR capabilities at the subsystem level, at the component level, and even at higher levels. We utilize commercial technology in our weapons systems in the Department of Defense a lot. If you go to the different R&D commands, long before DIUX, you will see TACOM's collaboration with the auto industry. If you look at our SBIRS program, Small Business Innovative Research, you can see many, many grants to dual use in commercial companies. So I do think the challenge has been overstated, but again, I think we do have a problem of getting access to the front end and the lumpiness of it across sectors. What I think people haven't talked about as much is getting access to foreign technology. We have a program called the Foreign Comparative Test Program, but that's for things that have already been developed abroad. But what's kind of interesting is we have a muscle that we don't use well. A number of the Army and other labs have offices abroad that research, review, and look at this technology, but we don't disperse much money there. We could get a lot more bang for the buck, and by the way, pay off some of that overhead of that expense by taking that muscle and exercising it. Our coalition warfare accounts are low. We don't spend much money on developing cooperative things to ensure interoperability across the different levels of capability with our allies. And so I think the foreign area is an area that really is ripe for effort. If you look at the defense labs, and by the way, I know there's a lot of focus on the next innovation coming from the commercial sector. It's hard to say where it will come from. It might just as well come from something exotic in a laboratory somewhere, in a defense laboratory somewhere. That said, I think there has not been a serious look at the defense labs in a long time. And I think the look needs to start with the question of, are they doing things that are being done in the private sector? Because if they are doing things that are already being done in the private sector, we shouldn't be spending our resources there. There really needs to be a top-down look, a bottom-up look at the labs from A to Z, because some of what's being done made sense 10 years ago, doesn't make as much sense today. There are issues of the ability of the labs to attract the best and the brightest talent today, given the other alternatives available to smart young engineers. Their issue about the aging of the workforce. I mean, my own sense of it, talking to people in the community and evaluating it, is that there is some realignment that's warranted here on the size and scope of our defense labs. The industry is another issue that we have to look at, and there's been much written about this, and I know some people won't agree with this, but again, my own view, when you look at the level of independent research and development in the defense industry. And again, you have to realize the defense industry's R&D, the U.S. government funds R&D for defense. That's not true in a lot of other sectors in most other countries in the world, all right? But by historic levels, our IR&D spending, the independent research and development of our large leading defense firms with their innovative capabilities is low. There's been something of an uptick, but it's low. Also, one has the sense that too much of it is focused not on the force of the future, but on the here and now, on incremental innovation that a customer is pushing them to do when it's almost warranted or they can see $1 of return for. And now, I don't have any problem with the defense industry making money, don't get me wrong, but part of the idea of this is to have it forward-looking. The metric that really, though, in the end gets to the heart of this is what about the department's organizational structure, its processes, and its practices? And you only have to ask the question almost to get the answer, and look at the name of this study, Driving Defense Innovation in a Change-Resistant Organization. The reality is the challenge here is as much about the limited receptivity of the department and its components to new and disruptive technologies as it is about impediments to access to new sources of innovation. And that's the core challenge ahead. And it really reflects two phenomena from the business and government worlds. One is the conservatism inherent in large, successful organizations and the reluctance of leading incumbents in economic markets. If you're the monopolist, it's hard to do paradigm shift. If you're an Air Force with a successful attack air fleet, your desire is not to disrupt it with UAVs, but to modernize and incrementally improve it. There's lots of literature on that, and that's what you've seen there. And that innate resistance is reflected in the inherent, long-standing reluctance to use the range of flexible authorities and processes that have been available in the department. GAO did a study last year on the use of other transaction authorities, and it just is woefully underutilized. And again, you can look at what NASA did with commercial space and allowing SpaceX and others to participate as illustrative of why didn't the Defense Department adopt that kind of approach a decade ago. There is no reason other than an institutional resistance to change from the customer community. Everybody wants to pin all of this on the acquisition community, and to be sure, the FAR-based system, is rigid and needs work, but it's not just the acquisition community, it's the customer community that drives this and its requirements. And it could direct the use of these OTAs and these alternatives, which allow you to write the rules you want. You don't have to use FAR-based rules today. There are commercial item rules. There's a range of opportunities you could do. So what do we do about all this? Again, my own sense and what the study says is, I wouldn't blow the whole thing up. I think we have learned a lot. We've made progress. And it's hard to know what you would blow it up and replace it with. But what I would do is I would generate forced change. I would do that in the existing system. I wouldn't play around with pilots on the side. I would do it through essentially a series of default mechanisms or forcing functions that are designed to create non-traditional on-roads for technology, adopt more commercial processes, and so forth. And let me make a few general points, and I'll leave you with a few concrete recommendations. I do think the challenges here transcend organizational structures. We've just had a reorg ongoing in this area on the Hill where we're dividing up the R&D side and the acquisition side. My own view is I don't see how it solves the problems we're talking about here today. The reorg in defense legislation in the last 2 years has also devolved more authority to the services. I also don't see how that solves this problem. And let me just give you two quick examples. One example is we have the challenge of transitioning technology from the lab to the warfighter, which I would argue is just as great as getting access to the high-end technology in the first place. How is creating a separate organization for research on the one hand and procurement on the other going to make transition easier? I have trouble seeing that. Likewise, on the devolution of authority to the services, if the Air Force Chief of Staff goes to AT&L, Undersecretary for AT&L, and says, I want to add these three capabilities to this, the Undersecretary of AT&L has in the past at times said, no, you're going to double the cost of this thing, and we can evolve it in spirally. We can do a lot of other things to achieve those effects. It's just not cost effective, and it's going to kill schedule, it's going to kill money, it's going to make this much more technically difficult. Now, fast forward, do you really think that the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition is going to be able to stand up to the Air Force Chief of Staff when he comes in and has that same request? I think it's a tougher road to hoe. So I don't think that the reform solves it. But there are no silver bullets here. There are variegated approaches. I think there are different things you could do at the prime level. I think there are things you could do at the subsystem level, and there are going to be varying degrees of involvement of commercial firms depending on the type of sector involved. Let me also say the Department of Defense, I'd like to make it more like Google, but it's not going to be Google in the end as well. And people have to understand it. I think there'll be some frustration in the people from the innovative world because they like us to go full bore that way. But of course, we have different missions, different objectives here. We have smaller production runs. We're never going to have millions of items bought in a lot of these areas, at least in the defense weaponry area. What I also think is that the department needs to move away from the so-called third offset. I think that that's been an interesting observation and a concept and helped to galvanize change. My own view, and today's not the day to lay that out in detail, is that I think we've already corrected and moved toward the balance toward high-end warfare, and I'm concerned that we're going to shortchange investment in the low-intensity type capabilities that we're more likely to use in the next 10 to 20 years, and I worry about the implications of the offset there. But what would I do? In a quick nutshell, before we get to a conversation, first of all, I do think we need a strategy-driven RDT&E budget. I think there needs to be an emphasis on investment strategy. I think it needs to be balanced between the high end, the irregular, and the nuclear deterrence. I think we probably need to plus up the defense RDT&E budget by, not too much, by about 10% to do that. And some of the other things I'm going to suggest could offset some of that funding. I think the S&T portfolio has to be realigned with that investment strategy. And again, I'm okay with investing with things like autonomy and artificial intelligence. I think that's sensible. But those are one investment out of other. And the notion that should be one investment out of a range of broad portfolio. The notion that we know we're going to get an offset from those things, to me, it's speculation at best. And so I think we have to cover our bets in a range of other areas. But fundamentally, I think at the core of our recommendations is we need, as I said, to make it a less unnatural act for the next SpaceX to do business with the department. And the way to do that is essentially to mandate the use of one or more of these commercial processes for new programs, whether they be R&D programs or procurement programs in certain areas. And I think we have to essentially require an escalation set of decisions and an exception rule that acquisition authorities have to get an exception to use the traditional FAR-based system. I think that's the only way we're going to really move the system forward. We need to set up a center of excellence, I think, with people who know more about using these alternatives, because what the GAO study showed, by the way, last year was that there weren't people enough in the different components that had the knowledge and the background for this. I also think we need to expand and reform the DoD modalities for accessing commercial technology. I would expand the service program to companies that are a bit larger. I would expand the dollars there. I would also bring equity investment, private equity, into the Pentagon to cover the gap period between companies who get those small front-end grants and then have nowhere to go for the next round. You create mezzanine financing by creating a set of one or more private equity funds like the InQtel model. There's just no reason why there's not a $500 million equity fund to be able to cultivate the defense technologies the department thinks is of interest. I think we ought to create centers of excellence at universities and targeted firms in lieu of trying to hire people into defense labs, like opening up new labs for the Department of Defense on the West Coast. Let's have centers of excellence at existing institutions out there and draw off what's there. There are a number of other measures. Let me just touch on one or two and then I'll close, which is, look, I think not enough's been talked about in all this with the role of prime contractors. The prime contractor's role in our system is they are the hunter and gatherer of technology, because they're the ones who come and make the proposals on new systems and on both from an R&D and a procurement standpoint. And we need to do a better job of metricing their performance. And that's been lost, I think, in all this discussion of walls between the department and the commercial sector, because you've got this, this big interplay of the defense primes that play the core role in our system. Well, let's make sure they're doing the right job, make sure they're using the right tools to do it, and empower them to do it. And I think that's very important in all this. On the foreign side, I have a number of recommendations there. I think we ought to increase our funding here for foreign acquisition, for international engagement. $250 million is nothing in the scheme of the defense budget, and will go a long way to drawing off front-end innovation abroad that our labs see, but they can't finance because there's either a reticence or no money to do it. We could take our coalition warfare funding and use money very readily to get some more bang for the buck there, and I think we need to, the paper talks about some of the technology transfer issues that would help with this agenda. On the labs, very briefly, I would immediately cut the personnel at the labs by 5% and take that money and use it for some of these other things, because I think there is that kind of dead wood there that could be cleared out, and I think that could be the beginning of an exercise and then the front end of an exercise to do a bottom-up review. So let me close there and say again, the challenge here is how do you get the next SpaceX to do business with the department and the department to accept the next SpaceX's offerings. And what we tried to do is lay out some ideas here that hopefully will move this forward. And with a particular reference to we need new leadership, and new leadership's coming to AT&L, or A on the one hand and R on the other, that will essentially use forcing functions to adopt some of these approaches. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jeff. You gave a lot of meat for us to tackle in the discussion. I appreciate that, and it is a truly interesting report. I'm going to kick off the panel discussion here, and I'd kind of peel back the cover a little bit and note that we have a pretty industry-heavy panel, I would say. Jeff and I both served time in the building, so to speak. Greg obviously did as well, but he brings that deep industry experience too. So, but I hope in our discussion we're going to tackle both the change resistance in the Pentagon and in the Department of Defense, but also on the industry side, because I think Jeff's, one of your closing points there was excellent, that we maybe don't spend as much time looking at the industry dynamics as we should. And since we have a very industry-focused panel, I hope we'll get to that. To my immediate right is Greg Dahlberg. As I mentioned, he's president at Dahlberg Strategic. He has 35 plus years of Washington experience. I got to know him pretty well at one time when he was Democratic Staff Director of the House Appropriations Defense Subcommittee. He moved on from there and actually went back and forth a little bit, was Undersecretary of the Army and Acting Secretary of the Army for a period of time, then went back to the Hill and ultimately moved over to industry to serve 6 years as Senior Vice President at the Lockheed Martin Corporation for Washington operations. To his right is Victoria Coleman. Victoria is a Senior Fellow at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. And she and a colleague at the Heritage Foundation recently published a paper entitled Reclaiming U.S. Defense Leadership on Innovation, 3 Priorities for the New Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, which caught my eye, a really interesting paper that I recommend you take a look at. Victoria's background is very much in the tech sector. She's basically served in a range of technology companies, Technicolor, Yahoo, and a variety of other firms out that I think of as sort of Silicon Valley firms. So she brings that perspective to the discussion. And then to her right is Jeff Reiter, who's founder and CEO of Glacier Point. And Jeff provides aerospace and defense consulting services to defense companies developing partnerships with commercial tech companies, providing collaboration opportunities for large companies, government customers, and startups. He also has extensive corporate strategy and experience as the Chief Strategy Officer at Excelis, and senior strategy positions at BAE Systems and other companies as well. So he has seen both the bigger side of industry, the more the prime end, but also both in terms of his work looking at mergers and acquisition, and in his current incarnation, working with a lot of startup companies, the small side as well. And then obviously Jeff is joining us for the panel discussion, so he can defend his work from the slings and arrows that we're about to send at it. And I guess I'm going to kind of direct my first question to Greg, representing the big bad behemoth of the defense primes in this discussion, among other things. And something that we talked about as we were preparing for this that was also raised prominently by Jeff in his remarks and in the report is the importance when you have when you're dealing with a large organization and you're trying to execute change and setting clear priorities and having them be communicated and consistent. In other words, they actually are priorities that are recognized throughout the institution. We talked a little bit as we were getting ready for this about the challenge that you've observed in doing that. So I would kind of start off by saying, you know, has there been much success in doing that? Obviously, Third FSS strategy was an attempt at setting some clear priorities for innovation. And where have we not succeeded? And then what might we do about it?
Yeah, it's a huge topic, and I will say right off the bat, I don't practice the black art of acquisition. I'm an interested observer, so I don't know all of the P's and Q's of that Jeff talked about, OTA and into the weeds, but it's pretty interesting stuff, and I really, first of all, compliment you on taking this on, Jeff. And I think the message I got was, hey, there's a lot of authority out here that could be used if you had the leadership and the desire to really, accomplish certain priorities. And the issue to me is, what are those priorities? I mean, what should a leader do? And in this incredibly complex area. So I just take on maybe DIUX a little bit, which was discussed, and from an industry, maybe a traditional industry perspective, since I lived that quite a bit. And I guess there's a little bit of frustration, I think, in the defense industrial community about that. There's kind of a viewpoint, frankly, that maybe it was unsaid, but perhaps the industry was being criticized for not being innovative, and you have to go outside to Silicon Valley where there's really innovation, and not enough innovation happens with the big primes. And I think that, as you can imagine, that didn't go over too well in the industrial community. I think if you look back, you got to look at the history of where we've been the last 8 to 10 years, and frankly, we've been in a down cycle in terms of money, obviously, in budget in the defense. It's always cyclic in the defense arena, and we've been in a down cycle. And so right at that time, by the way, the last big down cycle, we had a major contraction in the industrial community, which I would say we did not have this time, which frankly surprised a lot of people. A lot of people were predicting we would. And we didn't for a lot of reasons, but one thing, when you're in a down cycle, frankly, the new administration came in, and the first thing they told us is, hey, we're gonna emphasize cost. We're really gonna come in hard on fixed price, even in the development cycle, and push hard on cost. And obviously, we had the better buying power. 3.0, I think, was the last one we got, but a lot of kind of new emphasis on cost control, which doesn't produce a highly innovative environment. And basically, when you're in a down cycle, maybe that's not the best time to come in and really push hard on the cost button. If you really want heavy innovation, you want these folks to come in and invest at the same time. So I think, you know, there's a little historical point here that has to be thought through. And I think just from an investment standpoint, I do agree, Jeff, that, you know, the industry as a whole has been kind of light in using its own money on innovation and investment. A lot more stock buyback than maybe in the investment. But you got to remember, as we all do, that, you know, industry needs a return, and they're not in it. You've got to, if you're going to invest, you have to have some sense of return on that investment. And I think that's kind of where we didn't have really a strong sense of where the department wanted to go. It was kind of all over the lot. We got a lot of kind of nice long lists of potential neat technology and materials and so forth. You can go back to a lot of the kind of the lists of really exciting things that could be done. But we really didn't get a sense from the department, okay, here's the roadmap for the future. Here's the technology that if you invest in, that you have a reasonable sense of return on that investment. Lasers, hypersonic engines, you know, there's an incredible, interesting and very promising list of technologies, but you have to have a sense for where you're going to concentrate on. And we didn't get that. We were basically getting from the department a message of cost control. And so I don't criticize any of the leadership there. They're extremely bright and capable people, and they only had 24 hours in the day. So so they were pretty much focused on source selection issues and you know, responding to the Hill on fixed price versus best value and so forth. So, you know, and Congress did push them as well on cost control. So you know, it's a little, and I think the industry feels it's kind of getting beat up a little bit for basically being prudent. Let's face it, a board of directors of any of the big corporations can be sued by the shareholders. The management can be sued by shareholders for not being good fiduciary, responsible, making good decisions. And if you say, well, we're going to go invest in some new technology, but we don't really know whether the department is really there or not, it's pretty hard to do that. So I kind of put a little bit on the leadership of the department and the priorities that they set, and they clearly were not. And then one day they woke up and they decided, oh my goodness, our peer competitors are catching up to us. And the answer, instead of maybe coming to us with a more robust sense of where you want to go, like the old Bill Perry, you know, Harold Brown days of really, okay, here's our roadmap, was, hey, let's go out and establish a DIUX outside the mainstream. So you can kind of feel I think I'm speaking for most of the large primes in the defense area. I think there's a feeling of a little bit of frustration there, which can be solved by a really, and that's why I think, going one more step, and I'll stop, is the McCain reforms, which kind of recognize that and bring out the R&E side of the house and trying to step that up. And I think that's in recognition of the fact that, you know, we need some more, you know, decisive leadership, which can put that roadmap together, I think. And I think if you got that, I think you'd see industry, all of industry, really follow in, because, you know, everyone wants to know where they're going to go in the future. So I'll stop.
Thank you, Greg. I'm going to turn next to Victoria. And not to, by the way, if you'd like to respond to anything Greg said, please do. I encourage cross-panel discussion, and if folks feel absolutely compelled, you're jumping out of your seat, you can even perhaps interject. But another meaty issue that Jeff touched on is this issue of how do we essentially coordinate, actually I struggle to use the right word here because I'm not coordinate is right, but how do we make sure, I think sync is what I wrote down in my notes, how do we make sure that the government investment that we're making leverages the commercial investment, which is now the much larger, the commercial R&D investment by a range of actors, large and small, that you observed and all the work technology work that you did in the technology industry. How do we coordinate the government investment with that investment so we're getting the most out of the commercial investment, capitalizing on it, not duplicating it, not putting resources into things that others can more fruitfully invest in? And so I'd be interested in, he raised that as a significant issue. How do we get the most bang out of the R&D money we are spending to drive the kind of change that we would like to see? And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Andrew. So again, I want to add my thanks to Jeff for a remarkable piece of work. Before I make my remarks, perhaps I should also confess that I'm guilty of adding to the very already kind of tall list of reports. I recently completed a study for the Defense Science Board around the labs, the defense labs. So we spent about a year visiting labs and actually reviewing 200 studies that were previously done on the labs. And I mean this literally, there were 200 studies on the books that we had to look at. And as Andrew pointed out, I recently also wrote a little report with Tom Spohr over at Heritage, looking at ways that we can leverage in many ways this golden moment that McCain gave us through the reorg of AT&L to push some of these priorities that we all, I think, see and share forward. As Andrew said, I'm probably the person on this panel that has spent most of my time in the Valley. I've worked in Silicon Valley for 20 years, and at the same time, I've always had a strong relationship with DC and DARPA and the defense DoD community. I enjoy doing both, and I can tell you, it really is like oil and water. I wish there was a way to seamlessly move from one of my lives, my Silicon Valley life, to my DC life, and I tell you that just doesn't exist. And it's a problem that we need to solve. I mean, when I think about the kind of the broader kind of set of questions, because in order to leverage commercial innovation, you have to know what it is you want to do. It's not like you walk into a supermarket and you don't know what meal you're going to cook. There are endless opportunities. So in my mind, it all starts with knowing what your priorities are, and we heard about this already today. It's understanding, how you're going to position yourself in the world that's coming down the pike. And once we kind of know that, once we know, in many ways, what are the threats that we will face as a nation, what kinds of missions we might need to fight to defend against those threats, and then from those missions, think about the kinds of capabilities that our military would need in order to defend. That's the road that you take in order to figure out what technologies, what technological priorities you need to have for the next 10, 15 years. I don't know that necessarily this is how Bill Perry kind of thought through what he did when he came up with this notion of stealth and precision guidance as the pillars of the first or second offset. But I think that's the way that you need to do that part. So once it's like figure out where you need to go. Once you know that, then I think you go and look for the technologies that you need to make this happen. And certainly looking in the commercial sector, I would say is the first place that you go and look at. And not because people in commercial are smarter or cooler or whatever than the people on the other side. That's just not true. It's just that there are more of them. I mean, if you look at what happened at the ratio of defense R&D versus commercial R&D or innovation in the last 20, 30 years, the ratio is completely different now than it was back then. So it's not that we do less. In fact, we don't. As Jeff points out, we do more perhaps than we used to. It's just that the commercial side has grown so much more. And that commercial side is open to everybody else. And I think this is where our problem comes. In my mind, and honestly, again, living in the Valley, I don't see the DoD presence there. And DIUX, bless their heart, I'm glad they're there, but as my friend over at Heritage, Jim Carafano, says, they're a Potemkin village, really. I mean, they create a great deal of agitation in the community, which is a good thing, because we need to be thinking about these questions, but honestly, I don't think anybody believes that they're solving a problem. So there is this, this dichotomy. How do you even begin to comprehend what is possible in the Valley unless you have boots on the ground? You talk about boots on the ground, in Iraq and Afghanistan and all those places where we need to go and engage with the locals. What makes us think that we don't need to have boots on the ground in the Valley? You look at our labs. Our labs actually do a spectacular amount of work. They're very dedicated people. I don't know that they're the right size, and I don't know that all the work that they do is high quality, and I don't know that they necessarily do a good job of sharing facilities and so on, but I will tell you that once in a while they do amazing things. So many of you will have heard about a company called Oculus Rift that Facebook bought maybe 2 or 3 years ago. It's now kind of defining this whole immersive future that Facebook sees, let alone the rest of the world, the universe. And nobody remembers that actually that company that was incubated and the technology was built at ICT, the Institute for Creative Technologies, which is a UARC out in Los Angeles, paid for by the Army Research Lab. So that whole technology, that came right from DoD investments. We don't necessarily kind of recognize that. But the problem is that, again, when you look around in the Valley, you don't see boots on the ground from the defense research community. And I don't mean people, getting on an airplane and coming and visiting for a day. You need to have people there who know what's going on, who have the relationships with the researchers, who are able to bring in university professors as well as students to work with them. I want to give you a couple of examples, and then I will finish my remarks because I don't want to take too much time. At Berkeley, at a place called the YAMP Lab, maybe 5, 6 years ago, a couple of technologies called Kafka and Spark were created. These two technologies are critical for all the analytics that people do today on big data systems. So when you hear about data science, analytics, AI, all these things sit on top of Spark and Kafka. Chances are that these technologies were actually paid for by DARPA. But I will tell you that the defense community, the acquisition community, let alone the warfighter, will have to wait years before they get access to these technologies because they have to be absorbed by others, regurgitated by the SAPs of the world, and then eventually find themselves in the hands of the traditional vendors before they make it into the department. Like if we had people on the ground, we could cut that loop. Instead of waiting 15 years, you would have it in 2 years. Right? So that's one piece. The other piece, and this is just a personal experience I want to share with you. I have 3 children. My oldest son is 23. He's a data scientist, PhD student at the University of Pittsburgh. He had an internship offer from Google for this summer. So his mother, being the meddling variety, I convinced him to look into the labs. So I convinced him not to take the Google opportunity, instead to go join the AFRL, the Air Force Research Lab out in Kirtland in New Mexico, the Space Vehicles Directorate. So bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, Tim drives his car from Pittsburgh to Albuquerque, goes to orientation. The first thing that happens is they tell him, your security clearance is going to take 6 months. Meantime, every day you have to come in and sign as a guest. You can't use the gym. You can't use the computers, but here's some papers to read. You said something about talent. I don't think Tim is going to go back to AFRL next year. I mean, I'll try and meddle again, but chances are he's going to take Google up on their offer. So I think we need to do a great deal of work to make these two worlds come together. It really is not as simple as creating another Potemkin village. It really isn't.
Thank you, Victoria. Jeff, I think we've raised so many issues already that I don't necessarily want to throw a brand new question at you because I suspect you've got a lot to say about what's already been said. But given that you're kind of focused right now on this marriage between startups or medium-sized companies and larger companies, could you address some of these issues about what enables that to work and to maybe expedite the flow of technology from startup companies that may be innovating, not to say that big companies don't innovate as well, because they do, but as Victoria mentioned, there is this huge investment that's going on out there among startups that is also innovating. And how do you see that being expedited, getting those resources, that technology, up into defense systems?
Sure. So first of all, thank you, CSIS, Andrew, Jeff, for the great work you guys did. Got through your entire report in one long Starbucks sitting, and I'm better off for it, so appreciate it. I'll try to tie a few themes together. I spent the better part of the last 10 years in what I call the established contracting space, so I'm very familiar with the constraints that are put on the contemporary public defense company, which are significant, and I think particularly in the context of the sequestration environment, where you're kind of getting two messages. One is innovate, one is it's all about LPTA, and you're competing on a cost basis. So some consistency in messaging, I think, goes a long way in helping industry figure out what it could and should be doing. Certainly from a top line perspective, I think we've hit the bottom. But it doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be more money flowing into industry, because a lot of these plus-ups might go to readiness, and it might not necessarily flow through to capitalization accounts that would drive a logic for R&D. So I think some of the criticism on R&D, I think, is in some case misplaced, because what investors are looking for is a consistent, credible story about a long-term narrative that from the DoD that the money will be there. And that's a story, that's a commitment of funds, and that's a strategy ultimately that ties what we want to achieve to a technology plan that's resourced. And that, frankly, hasn't been the case, particularly in downturn. It's really not clear at this point what that strategy is. So picking up on the theme of commercial technology, I wholly agree that there's always been a large commercial aspect to the sector, but in a lot of the work that we're doing now, we hear it every day that the question of commercial technology is more relevant today than it's ever been, that the availability of relevant and robust commercial technology is greater than it's been before. And the real issue is that these different pieces of the ecosystem aren't purpose-built to work together. So I don't pretend that startups have all the answers. I don't pretend that Silicon Valley has all the answers. I think there's a little bit of a fawning over Silicon Valley that's overstated, and there's very much a sort of East Coast, West Coast divide about how to think about things like artificial intelligence. On the East Coast, it's there's some scary concepts associated with it. We better get there first. On the West Coast, artificial intelligence is going to save the world. I think there's a marriage of those different viewpoints in those different communities, and we want to try to bring those communities of interest together. So when it comes to DIUX and other initiatives, I don't really criticize any of them individually. I think the real point is you got to get to work, and you got to learn by doing, right? And that's communities of interest that aren't accustomed to working together starting to spend more time in one place. Whether it's on a project basis, it's on a conference basis, it's that there are programs or shared space or whatever it might be. It's that time and service aspect to innovation, which is we don't know what we don't know, so let's start working on projects together. So I think the mistake that's actually very consistent with the way DoD has done things for a long time is to try to solve the problem and then deploy that solved solution or that solution, as opposed to let's get to work on a number of activities, learn what we can, and feed that back into the system and build from there. So is a $40 million DIUX fund going to solve a whole lot of problems in a several $100 billion enterprise? No. But building that talent base, recruiting and giving them a path forward, demonstrating strategic intent about change, those things are really important. The point about Google and giving folks a place to come to work in a meaningful way within DoD and the broader enterprise, that stuff matters a lot. The work we're doing between startups and large companies, what we see is I'd say a curiosity. If you're an established defense entity, you're listening to all this discussion about innovation, and you're kind of in a wait and see mode, which is the reality is that if you are purpose-built to compete and profit within the FAR and within a complex and somewhat opaque acquisition community, the things we all criticize, that's what the established defense industry is actually really good at doing. So if you're in that situation, do you really want to see interlopers coming in? Do you really want to see commercial solutions to, you know, your protected space? You don't hear that stated out loud a lot, but the answer, just from a sort of Porter's 5 forces standpoint, is no, you don't. So I think there's a healthy skepticism about, you know, what all this commercial technology means to the established community, and to the extent that there are contractors that want to engage in events or, you know, opportunities with startups, we certainly encourage that, and we see an interest in that. But this is not a solved model by any means. I think the issue is there relevant capability in, for example, the startup community? Pound for pound, you know, a tech startup is more innovative, arguably, than any, you know, business entity that's out there. So it's not that they're going to solve really complex systems engineering and integration challenges or work within really complex operating environments, but a lot of innovation is about application engineering, right? It's about understanding an incredibly specific problem and then taking what's already on the table and applying it. So these programs that we run, where we're putting startups together with large companies and also with the acquisition community, it's really more about learning and getting feedback and growing. It's about the cultural aspects of, you know, the large corporation that takes a month to sign an NDA versus the startup that signs an NDA over breakfast. And, you know, why is that? Why is the contracting, you know, why is it? It's because the contracts community deals in months and years, and the NDA is, you know, it could be 10 folks working on some critical path technology. We just have to start identifying and troubleshooting those challenges. Otherwise, we risk I'd say the alternative is solving it, you know, in a lab and then deploying it once we have it figured out. So, you know, our view is these initiatives aren't necessarily the answer in and of themselves, but the portfolio of activities are important to starting to develop that runway that we can build on. And the last thought is the idea that we can you know, identify, develop, and protect technology. I think those days are over, and you know, there's plenty of evidence of that. So if you flip that on its head and you say, we just assume that our adversaries or the competitive community already have those technologies, we can't protect them, and the question is about, you know, how do you take that technology and apply it? It really sort of turns the R&D equation 180 degrees and puts more emphasis on application and innovation of existing technology, because there's a lot of evidence that a lot of our competitors already have. Either they have it today or they will have it at some point in the near future. So.
I'm going to open up the free-for-all. I think Greg had some comments, and then we'll get to Jeff.
Okay, real quick, my experience with small startups and big companies, which has been, you know, Lockheed Martin, every year, I don't know, they buy, I don't know, 4 or 5 small startups into the big beast, as well as they have incredible relationships across the country. Lockheed, the Skunk Works is one of the labs it has. It also has other labs. I remember talking to the Lockheed Space Lab guy, and said, what relationship do you have to other startups and the engineering schools across the country? He pulls out this Rolodex, basically, of, he said, I know every single you know, dean of engineering from, you know, the top 50 schools in the U.S. and many overseas, plus I know, here are the startups I know in Silicon. I think, so in other words, what I'm saying is, I think there is a lot of collaboration going on between large and small. The problem with small is scalability. You just simply, there's so many, they're good ideas, but when you bring them into the DoD world, where you gotta operate 100% of the time in 40 below and 120 degrees, you know, environment, and it's got to be perfect because people's lives are on the line. That's a different ballgame, and that's really where you kind of need, you know, the big brother out there to help with systems engineering and so forth. And it can work for sure. There are great, good ideas out there. I think the bigger issue for this kind of theme here is what I hear from folks on the outside who want to get into the inside is the acquisition system is totally disincentivizes any new entrant from coming into the DoD environment. And it's not the industry, defense industry, that is promoting that kind of discontent. It's just there. It's pretty easy. IP, another huge issue. when folks from the outside come into the DoD environment and say they got to get rid of their IP, what do you mean IP? I have to give you my IP or sell it to you? This is anachronisms to margins. I mean, 7, 8, 9% margin in development, not going to fly with a lot of folks out in the commercial world. So counterfeit parts in the electronics area, huge issue. You might have seen the hearings every now and then that happen at Capitol Hill when there's a Chinese part in some airplane or electronic piece that ends up that was commercially bought, but unfortunately, not all the safeguards were fully implemented, and all of a sudden Congress is going crazy because you've got counterfeit parts and things. Huge issues which are really turnoffs for this relationship to blossom, but it really comes back to the acquisition system. That really could, if you want to get new entrants and more competition, it's got to start with an acquisition system that actually allows for this kind of collaboration, and it does not.
All right, Jeff, I want you to respond to what's just been said, but I also want to throw another one at you that you can respond to also, which is I was struck, obviously, by, well, I should say obviously, I was struck by your comments essentially about make the FAR the alternate path and use alternate mechanisms as the main path. So sort of let the counterculture conquer the culture. And at the same point, you talked about the GAO report that said that certain tools, which I think many of us are fans of, like OTA, are not well understood by the workforce, and we got to grow our expertise. So is it even possible for the counterculture to conquer the culture, given that the workforce may not be ready to execute on a lot of these alternative tools that, yes, the authorities exist, but that we haven't utilized very much?
Well, that's one of our recommendations, is to create a center of excellence in OSD somewhere in the ATL community to use these alternative contracting mechanisms and to allow, 1,000 flowers to bloom, right? And you can tie that with DIUX, because, by the way, I would not kill DIUX. Don't mistake my comments. I grant you I've heard all the same issues raised by defense companies who tell me, it's not like I didn't know where Silicon Valley is. We had 10 ventures in the last 2 years. I've heard a lot of that, okay? But I take your point on the outreach, and I think it's useful, and they're doing some interesting things. I put it into the system. I put it on steroids, and I build off that and use that in part as the beginning of the Center of Excellence to do all these alternative things. And I would say to any small company that they think they have something nifty for defense, the Defense Department, if it has the will, can deal with them, all right? Now, you're not going to get rid of everything. All right, and the IP issue is a serious issue because the Department of Defense says if I'm funding something, I want some rights in it so there could be competition, and I don't want Joe to get a monopoly in it. But that said, you can use these OTAs to rewrite the box, create a box and write the rules, and over time, that could become a new standard. All right, but we have to have a leadership willing to do it. We have to have increased trained people. I wanted to comment on 2 other points here. I know there's this desire for a roadmap, and I agree with that to a fair degree, but I would say when you're in charge of AT&L, and I'm going to treat it as if it's one today, it's really like you're a diversified portfolio manager, right? You're a stock, you're a mutual fund manager. You're putting bets. You don't know which things are going to go to fruition. And so it's hard for the department to give industry, in fairness, a really good, roadmap, because a lot of this is bets. Part of my problem with the offset methodology is the notion that Bob Work said the next offset, the gravy of the next offset is going to be artificial intelligence and autonomy. Well, I'll tell you, for sure that's worth making a bet on, among others, but the very ubiquity of the technology, okay, one of their basic theses is that the second offset eroded because of the broad dissemination of technology. Well, let's look at autonomy and artificial intelligence. Anybody who thinks this isn't going to be anywhere, okay, is dreaming. And so the notion that we're going to get an offset, a military edge that's not ephemeral from that, I say, how do you know? Are you the Warren Buffett of defense planners where you're sure of that? I don't think anybody can know that. So that's why my point is, let's make a series of educated bets, and you can have a roadmap to that extent, but not much more than that, because the truth may be, and this is a bit counter to all the focus on commercial technology, maybe because of the ubiquity of commercial technology, the edge, such as it is, might come from some exotic thing in a lab somewhere that's defense unique. That's my 2 cents.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments. I couldn't agree more, Jeff. I think, again, there are all these shiny objects that we see in the valley and so on, but if you take a long, hard look and see what we need today, I would say, for example, hypersonics will have a problem. Right? Any of you that are in that community, you will know that there's a very big gap. You look at MDA, this stuff is the bread and butter of companies like Lockheed. I believe that before you start looking into exotics, it really is imperative that we pay attention to some of these key critical gaps, because it doesn't matter if you're not able to defend the homeland and against hypersonics, the game is up. We'll be having a different conversation. So I think that's a very important piece. The other thing that I just wanted to emphasize, and it's been said a number of times here, is that you can have all the innovation on the planet. Unless you have an acquisition that is aligned with that innovation, good luck. And I want to give you a specific example. So this year, having finished with the lab study, participated in a software design and acquisition study for the Defense Science Board. And I know this because I build software for a living. So my day job outside of Potomac is I'm the Chief Technology Officer of the Wikimedia Foundation. So we build Wikipedia, a small service that many of you are familiar with. We cut code for a living. And I can tell you that, we build code in an agile way, in sprints for every 2 weeks and so on. There's a reason for that. The reason is that we can't do it any other way. These systems are way too big. So the Department of Defense, on the other hand, still believes that they can buy software in 3-year increments. And, it's just impossible to do that. So as we look at this study, we try to educate people about what it means to build software in an agile way, and they can do all this work. But if the acquisition person goes to Lockheed and says, I'm going to give you a contract for 3 years, and you're going to tell me what exactly you'll deliver for me in terms of software in 3 years, all the work that these people have done over here goes to waste, because Lockheed still has the same constraints that they have today. And also, I just wanted to bring this back. The department and the way that it thinks about technology and the way it acquires technology, it induces behavior on the vendor base. You can't expect the vendors to go outside the box, innovate, be disruptive, if the department does not support that inside. It's a very tightly closed loop. And again, don't get me wrong, I believe that the Lockheeds of the world ought to be much more ambitious about how they push the frontiers, and they need to be much more capable inside the organization of taking innovations that perhaps come in through startups and doing something with them versus killing them at the end of the day. But that depends on the abilities department to absorb that innovation and do so in a way that these companies can thrive and be successful and be there to support the department for hypersonics that Google is not going to do.
More? Okay, I'll throw out, you made me, you're.
Let me just say, Greg, I'm going to let you have a comment, then I'm going to turn to the
Oh, okay.
audience. So I want the audience to know I'm coming your way, but go ahead.
So leadership in R&D is really important, and you made some really good points about that. I just was thinking to myself, well, what about the railgun, for instance? I mean, where was the leadership? That came out of the Navy, and it didn't come out of OSD, that's for sure. NRL, yeah. As an example, and I was thinking, I was having a chat with a former senior OSD person and about the third offset, and this person said, hey, we have a plan. We can tell you what the third offset is, and it's obviously AI, but he says it's a whole lot of other stuff like range and standoff distances and so forth because of the future. And I said, well, have you been talking to the Navy? Because I don't think the Navy, and this is a problem. The Navy isn't into standoff. The Navy is building $13 billion carriers at the moment. Hopefully it'll be much less, but the first one's expensive, and they don't build that so they can sit out in the middle of the Pacific. They're talking about being upfront, and they are going to stay upfront. That's their view. And what they're doing is doing a distributed warfare. A lot of you in the room know about this, a distributed warfare system where they're arming the ships, all of the surface fleet to have a lot more firepower, a lot more defensive and offensive capability, and bring the fight in and so forth. I said, now, if you're industry, I listened to OSD over here tell me stand off and give us the weapons and all kinds of different capability for longer standoff range. And I talked to the Navy, and they're going, we're not interested in that. We're interested in networking our fleet and getting our systems all hooked up and putting, we want some missiles that do this and that. So what do you, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, leadership in terms of, that's where a department needs to have some sense, first get its own act together, but then communicate clearly to industry, because industry can't invest in everything. It will put big bets on certain areas if it's told by the leaders where they want to go. But right now, we all know the Navy and railguns and lasers and so forth. We're not so sure. Air Force is now picking up lasers. That's interesting. But where's the department? Where's the department want to go? And that's kind of my point on that.
All right, I want to turn to audience questions. Some of them may be from industry. Well, I don't know. We'll find out. So please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and ask a brief question, because I want to get in several, and our time is getting short. So up here.
Can you hear me? Thank you very much. I'm Peter Morozov with EMAPS. I've heard over and over again the need to get visibility into what other people are doing so you can get innovation. You can't innovate if you don't know what the other people have done. And there are hundreds of thousands of efforts out there which you potentially have to be aware of what they're doing. And what I have not heard anyone talk about is a categorization scheme that you can take all these diverse elements and pull them together into a unified library. Have you got any thoughts on that? Did it enter into your thinking?
I'll take a crack at that one. So we've been working with some of the different offices and agencies around how they are interested in collaborating with more commercial-like entities. And what we're finding is that they're each kind of coming at it their own way. It's kind of the problem that you're describing, only, it's siloed and segregated. And I think there's an argument for more of a marketplace, of a supply and demand equation that puts together, lots of different agency, office interests, unsolved problems, and both on that's the supply side, that's the demand side, and then on the supply side, there are a lot of companies that are very interested, I think, in doing work, and they're just struggling with the barriers to entry. So, we're working on this on a very micro level, but you need to have an effective marketplace, you need scale. So, can you get lots of different commercial entities into, I'm talking like an online platform where you've got all sorts of different entities that can communicate their capabilities, their strategic intent, and on the demand side, that can communicate unsolved problems, and you can start to see that there are a lot of patterns that you could put together that start to form a market in and of itself. Right now, it's completely fragmented and disaggregated, and different communities are approaching that in their own way, and there's even a little bit of a dogfight. Well, if we get there first, other folks will jump on our platform. So you start to see this competing silo situation going on. So there's an opportunity to come top down and build that marketplace out.
Do you see any overarching set of categories that can be used to help bring all these diverse people together?
A taxonomy that's shared. Yeah, that's
Taxonomy or ontology or whatever. You thought about what could be done on this matter?
Victoria, when you looked at the labs, I mean, I know DoD has these communities of interest, which establishes sort of an organizational framework. But did you find that was helping, or is it not yet fully implemented? Did you had experience with that?
So it's actually variable. There are, I believe, 21 communities of interest, and some of them are much more active than others. Some of them are merely, frankly, talking shops. In others, they go much further into kind of planning joint work and also utilizing facilities. But our sense in the panel, in the task force, was that they don't go near far enough. We would like to see a coordination of efforts across the labs, really to have a strategic R&D plan that is executed by all the labs in unison versus having pockets. And you talked about the railgun. You know, you go to 3 different labs, you will see 3 different railguns, and you say, okay, what are you doing, and what are you doing, and how you're working together. So I think we can do more. I think an opportunity would be those communities of interest could in fact expand the point of view to include commercial technologies. So since we have that framework, you can imagine them populating it. And in fact, it will be a jolly good thing for them to do because they will become this way familiar with what exists out there.
And we had another question back here.
Sure. Scott Augenbaugh. I'm at MD5, the National Security Technology Accelerator. We're housed under AT&L and MIBP. We're new, and we're handling many of the same types of problems and issues that you were talking about here today. When it comes to culture, though, one of the things I'm really concerned about is the frozen middle of the Pentagon. So you can have all great leadership directives up here, and you can have lots of junior officers down here that love innovation. But the middle of the Pentagon is what kills this. So how would you address the middle of the Pentagon? It's a business concept, but how do you apply that to thinking about the Defense Department?
Can I say something? It's not going to be popular, but I think Jeff mentioned this already. I think it's called workforce shaping. That's how you do that.
I agree. You know, we'll work with groups where the leadership says one thing and then it gets handed over and then it just disappears, or you run into a wall, or, you know, it takes 6 emails to get the conference call number, and meanwhile other folks can't. I mean, it's just crazy stuff. You know, you get your information over there, someone loses it. Are they really committed to these things, or is it just something they're talking about? I think, you know, I agree that the junior level, there's energy. You know, they haven't been around long enough to be, you know, disenfranchised. At the senior level, I think some folks really get it and are driving that. And in the middle, there's a thick level of, you know, bureaucratic resistance. You got to start picking folks that are doing it right, shining a light on them, rewarding them. You got to start picking them. This is the point about doing it and being active. You got to find the opportunities where it's working and shine a light on it and build off of it. It's not like they're not happening. I just don't think we're putting enough attention on the success stories. So, you know, wherever it happens, you got to pull it out and shine a light on it. It's true in industry. It's the same thing.
I'll just add a little bit more. It's even worse than that, I think, because you have geographic issues too. Who is making the decision at the middle level even? Army is a great example of that. It's very decentralized buying centers and acquisition centers. And then you have the Pentagon. And one of the arts of acquisition from an industry standpoint is who is going to really make the decision? Is it going to be that person in Huntsville who says he or she is going to make the decision, or is it going to be someone in the Pentagon? And there's even an art to that, so it gets pretty complicated.
Another question here on the aisle.
Good morning, Christian Gilbert from OSD. I work at the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. I'm one of those middlewares. I kind of feel like I'm in the wild here, but I do appreciate the panel. Jeff, thank you for your work. Andrew, thanks for holding these sessions. So my question is 2-part. Number one, as someone who's responsible for innovation in the department, working with activities and mapping the ecosystem and making sure that ecosystem has the top cover to be able to do these things, one of the things we're noticing is transition, adoption, early adoption of activities. We know that the special operations community has a really good exemplar for how they rapidly accept technology. We have found that programs of record in those activities aren't necessarily capable of ingesting them. So I'd like to hear maybe the panel's ideas about how we in the department could work on that transition.
I
got one. But,
all right. Well, can I start with Jeff? Because you touched on something that I wanted to pick at from his remarks, which was this contrast you made between incremental improvement and leap ahead, to put words in your mouth, what one time we called maybe transformation. And yeah, so my first thought was similar to his, and the perspective of if we aren't budgeting for and planning incremental improvement in our systems, how do they ever absorb all this innovation that's happening very rapidly out in the commercial space? So I want to let you talk to that, and then we'll come to Greg.
Well, you need both. I think we're not as bad at we're not as bad at incremental improvement of existing systems. We sort of know how to do that, I would think, and the programs of record can do that. Look, when I was the Pentagon, people would call me up every week from some small company here or there. I have this nifty widget. It really belongs on this program. It will really improve it. And, you know, I would dutifully go back to the program, sometimes to the prime. In 2/3 of those cases, at least, you would find there's some very legitimate reason why that nifty widget didn't make sense, right, either from a cost standpoint or some other standpoint. So I think, you know, the leap ahead, that's really hard. We have had the stories I came back to, the UAV story, where OSD had to put money in the budget because a lot of guys in the Air Force named Speedy didn't want it, all right? And the same thing in the SpaceX story, which I've had some proximity to over the years of that. I think maybe you need some kind of a high-level transition board to force parochial buyers to look more broadly at those technologies, because I think that is one of the central challenges we have. Let me just add one other point before I forget, which I didn't mention, is I didn't really mention Congress in my remarks. And Congress is at the heart of all this in some ways, right? Because if you look at the 500 requirements in a FAR contract, I was at a hearing recently where somebody mentioned it, I think at SecDef's nomination hearing, you know, Congress has mandated, you know, most of them. And so we have to have some acquiescence from Congress on this. Now, again, we could use these alternative authorities and sketch a new board and ultimately go back to Congress and say, why can't this work? But Congress has to play a role in the solution here, as it's been part of the problem.
Yeah, sometimes it's part of the solution, too. I would say, you know, it's a mix. You mentioned UAVs, for example. Before anyone in the department worked on UAVs, Congress jammed the money in. I was part of that. A guy named Jerry Lewis. Now, it was parochial. He had jobs in the district and all the rest, but it didn't matter. I mean, and you know where we put the money? In the Intel budget, because that's the only place that actually, that's where it started. I mean, way before the department was totally against it, everyone, for a long time, but then all of a sudden they all love it now. But there are a lot, so Congress can be a good innovator.
I think what Greg's trying to say is the appropriators help and the authorizers hurt.
Yeah. So, but I'm defending Congress just a little bit. I also see the other side on occasion. I just say I think the acquisition system is a huge impediment to big leaps ahead in innovation. I think, you know, the rules are set against it. And of course, the budget is another issue in and of itself. But, you know, I think there could be really important, you've got to take away some of this resistance to change that comes into play. Just look at how transactions are, you know, basically you're dumbing down a lot of these RFPs so you can get a bunch of competitors in, so you can have competition. What you get, so when it's been mentioned a couple of times, if it could be a small company, big company, middle-sized company comes in with a great new widget that says we can really advance the ball, the first kind of reaction from the community is, yeah, but we got to go through all our process and our competition, and they dumb it down, and pretty soon you don't have much, and you have a big development program for 10 years so everybody can compete fairly and all of the rest, so, and you lose it. And I've seen it many times happen, but I just go back to JIDO. I think that's the one, here's where Secretary Gates just lost his patience with the community and said, look, I got a war to fight, I've got an IED issue, and you're going to give me a 10-year development program for that? That's not acceptable. And that was the answer from the acquisition community. So he set up JIDO out of it. They had some very innovative, you know, we all know what happened there, but the process they set up was really interesting, and guess what happened to it? You know, it's now gone and back into the big, you know, monolith of the acquisition community. They couldn't take it. And it's too bad, because I think that's a really good example of what could be done.
So if I may just add a thought to this transition problem that you talked about, and you know, that's a problem, of course, that plagues not only the department, but honestly every other business that has a research lab. It's notoriously difficult to do that transition. I found that works the best if you have people in the middle that understand both sides. I mean, just think about the daily tempo of what it's like fighting a war and what it's like being in the AFRL in Kirtland. I mean, they're just different time machines that people operate in. The way that we kind of, you know, fix this sometimes in the commercial world is through this new discipline called product management. So you have people whose job it is to translate requirements back into technology solutions and make that link happen. I don't think necessarily the department even comprehends that there is a need for that. If you take something like SCO, for example, the Strategic Capabilities Office, which in my mind is another one of these so-called Potemkin villages, because it doesn't solve the main problem that Jeff was positing. But you could take something like that and change it around a little bit so it becomes truly, you know, the product management kind of office for the department, whose job it is to match what the R&D communities are doing with what the warfighter needs at the other end. Because I'll tell you, it's the hardest thing in the world, and it's not going to happen if it's nobody's job to make it happen.
That's really my job, so I think you take it seriously.
There was one last question. I know we're a little here on the second row.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that'll have to be the last question, unfortunately.
Right, it's kind of a big one.
Here comes the...
I'll try to be quick. My name is Paul Leckis. Oh,
Yeah, right behind you there.
sorry.
Oh.
Oh. Paul Leckis, until recently I was a lawyer at DoD. What do you see as the likelihood of there being an entity, something like Incutel, that can help bridge the divide with Silicon Valley and also speed the time from development to use?
Well, that's what I proposed, essentially. I'd like to see, I mean, I do believe DoD has the legal authority to do it. They would have to reprogram some money, but you may want to go to Congress for that. But I think it would have the authority to begin to do that, to create the infrastructure for that, because again, that's an alternative way of funding development that is, you know, essentially on an outsourced basis. And, you know, the kinds of things that Greg is frustrated about with the system, that's what these other kinds of models can help you to get to, you know. And I think we could solve a lot of it if there was creative focus on this at the department.
I'll add, you know, if the IP is the lifeblood of a startup, you know, time is the oxygen. You know, they're dying when they try to enter into this community and everything stalls. They're going to walk away. So, you know, the West Coast money will not support activities in the government space. And if you're in one of these split models and you talk about in your business plan going to work with DoD, it's toxic, right? So it would create two communities, and I think at that point you'd either be in one community or the other. I think it might be difficult to be in both, but you know, I've heard it said, oh, millennials aren't interested in national security and things like that. I don't think that's true, actually. I think there's a lot of evidence that folks want to get involved in solving really hard problems, and there's a lot of hard problems here. And I think that message is starting to get out. You're starting to see some interesting activity going on at some of the universities with Hacking for Defense and some of these sort of organic, you know, programs, incubators and accelerators. So again, it's not that we're there yet, but things are moving in the right direction. I think these kinds of vehicles would help bridge the gap where some of these companies, they're purpose-built to go to work in national security and defense, and they're struggling with the financial equation. So I think it would help a lot. As for the likelihood of it, I have absolutely no idea.
I wrote a provision into law. I mean, I was a staffer, obviously, but which authorized and funded the Army Incutel, which was in 2000, something like that. And I kind of lost track, but I checked into it.
Still exists.
It still exists.
Army Ventures.
But the Army didn't want to use it, and
Exactly.
they didn't put more money into it, and it's withered because of that,
Yes,
okay?
it has not been
There's a custom
supported.
resistance to change.
Yeah, and that's the point. The institution was not in favor of this. And, we ran into the same kind of institutional problem, and they weren't interested in doing it.
Hence the name of the report.
Can I do one last shout out for the labs? Because I know that we beat them on the head a lot, but this notion of the center of excellence that is located in a place that people would want to go to. So the ARL has pioneered this concept of the open campus, and they did exactly that. So they did it both in Adelphi, here in the area, as well as in Los Angeles. And I can imagine how many regulations they had to break in order to make this happen, how many walls they had to break down, but it's entirely doable. Like if you don't, take no for an answer, even within the system, you can make amazing things happen.
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up. And I will say there was an entire topic that we didn't get to, that we may have to have a whole separate event on, which both Jeffs raised on the whole international flavor, and a very intriguing comment, Jeff Reiter, about maybe we need to rethink technology security altogether in the current innovation environment, the way we think about it. So we'll have to save that for another day, but please join me in thanking the panelists for a really interesting discussion.